Hey everyone, this is Paul from Thinking Christian, and in this video what I want to do is talk about how it's possible that God could have created time before time. Now this is a pretty serious issue because if you think about it, if time begins, there's no really before the start of time. And I used to get really hung up on this when I was a skeptic because I was like, how is the idea of God coherent or consistent if we expect there to be creation or causality before time itself? And I had assumed that causality and creation both required time. And I no longer think that. And in this video, I'm going to explain why and what some of the different options are for theists to explore God's relationship to time. And then I'll tell you the one that I think, but I don't hold to it super strongly. So perhaps I'll change my view. Who knows? So the first thing to realize is a discussion about this, about God's relationship to time, really comes up in these discussions around cosmology, Big Bang, God as the sort of prime mover. And because the Big Bang is the start of space-time itself, or time and space itself, there is no before the Big Bang, at least not before temporally. So if we're looking for a cause or an explanation for the Big Bang, such a cause would either need to be a logical cause or some sort of explanation that doesn't require a temporal sequence. Theists really need to be careful with their language here, I'll just say, because there can be sloppiness. Even saying before invokes in us ideas of time that we may not want to think about, or we may think about causality involving temporality or involving change with or through time that isn't necessarily the case, and that's what we will be talking about. And one thing I should mention too, so Augustine around the 4th century thought God didn't create the universe at a point in time, rather he created it, simultaneously with time, which I'll say modern cosmology has kind of vindicated Augustine on this particular point, even though some people followed Aristotle for a long time. So when we are talking about the Big Bang, we're asking the question of why and whether the start of space-time itself needs an explanation. And there are plenty of people and some atheists out there who don't think so. They think, the universe can just exist necessarily and time can just exist. And that's kind of what we'll be talking about. However, if the Big Bang is the start of time itself, and if there's a cause to the Big Bang, such a cause would need to exist outside of time or atemporally. And this is what William Lane Craig says. He says, quote, "Such a cause must transcend space and time, since it created space and time. Therefore, it must be immaterial, timeless, and non-physical." Now, some people are going to question whether causation itself requires time. And I'll explain here the relationship between causation and creation in a second. But hopefully that's very clear that if causation requires time, then creation would require time as well. So icosahedron said, what does it mean to create time? If creation is when something didn't exist at a time t1 and then exists later at a time t2. To which I would say, if that's how you're going to define creation in terms of time, then sure, there cannot be the creation of time itself because creation presupposes the existence of time. But notice how this claim, and I'm not trying to say it like this, but notice how this claim is going to beg the question in favor of time being required for causality or creation by invoking it in its definition. So if it's possible for creation or causation to happen outside of time, we would need a definition of creation or causation that doesn't necessarily invoke it in and of itself. And I'm going to argue that I will come up with such a definition, not for the sake of removing time from it, but a more general view of creation and causality that does not depend on time. That is perhaps a better definition of creation and causality. So my definition of creation is this. A is created by B if and only if B's action is what causes A to exist. And this is the link between creation and causality. So my argument would be time is necessary for creation if and only if time is necessary for causality. Time is not necessary for causality, and therefore time is not necessary for creation. So now, if you agree with this argument, we then just need to talk about whether or not we can have causality without time. And I'm going to argue yes, and I'm going to give you two reasons why. Now, the main objection you're going to see is, what if time is required for B to act? Suppose you accept my definition of creation involving causality, but we say for B to have any acting powers or actual powers, there needs to be time. And my response is, we have examples where B's actions or causal power is independent of time or perhaps outside of time. And as a result, I think then we don't necessarily need time to be required for B's action. And if that's the case, then of course it is possible for God to create time outside of time itself. So the first reason, and this is a weaker reason, is just that we acknowledge that causation is often time invariant. And this is TI, the letters TI, like LTI. This is from systems theory. And the reason this is a little bit weak is somebody could still say, well, perhaps an act of creation must be done in, through, or across time. So even if it doesn't matter when you do the causation or the creation, you could still argue that causation itself requires the passage of time, or requires, T2 minus T1, even if the actual T1 and T2 don't matter to it. So this is similar to the wide sense stationarity that you would see in random processes, where rather than depending on the actual time, it just depends on the difference of times or the passage of time from whatever you could consider to be your initial event, or the sort of relative offset. So I think that would be a possible way out. But the reason I mention this is we acknowledge that causes can have effects that are independent of the actual time that it happens, which I think would give us reasons to suggest that perhaps causation is independent of time, or at least independent of any absolute time. But this would basically tell people, well, you would need to have perhaps relative time would be the way that you would say that. And I would say, okay, fair enough. Maybe you would need relative time to it. But the main thing I would say is we have examples of causation independent of time that would break logic if there was time involved. So let me give you an example. Here's atemporal logical causality that would cause problems if there was any temporal factor to it. So consider a vector space V, which is a subset of R2. Those of you who have taken linear algebra or elementary linear algebra are going to know this example. It's pretty simple. And this is over the scalar field of the reals with a basis that's just the set E1, where E1 is just the vector 1, 2. And consider the vector U, which is 2 times E1, which is 2, 4. Now this is going to be in V necessarily because E1 is our basis. So E1 being in V implies that U is in V. And as a result, there is no, and there cannot be a time where E1 is in V and U is in V. And this is because of both the axioms of vector spaces and E1's presence in there. And you could argue the combination of the axioms of vector space and E1's presence are what cause there to be U. And this cause needs to be atemporal, because if there was a time in which E1 was in the vector space and U wasn't, then V wouldn't be a legitimate vector space, and it would break the axioms that it's assumed to have. So you can't have it be a vector space with a basis and then at a later time actually becomes a vector space if it always was a vector space. So if we're considering this, I would say we consider the fact that the axioms of vector space and E1 themselves, or that set, or perhaps that collection, is what causes U to be in V1. Because if E1 wasn't there, then U wouldn't be there. If A wasn't there, U wouldn't necessarily be there either. So as a result, we would say those things cause U to exist in the set V. And even though they do cause this causation is independent of time, once again showing that you can have logical causality without time. And if there was any time involved, then you would actually have problems or logical contradictions. And I think you can actually abstract this in general. So let me kind of take you through it and show how this works for almost any logical syllogism. This is basically like saying, premise one, if E1 is in V and V is a vector space, then U will be in V. And, E1 is in V, therefore U is in V. And E1 is just in V, or you could argue, as soon as you decide V, as soon as you look at the vector space with the basis E1, that vector space has U in it, and there's not a time when U is not in it. And I'd argue any syllogism in the form of modus ponens wouldn't necessarily involve time at all. You just have anything where P implies Q, P, then Q. So if P is true, then Q is true. There's no really time invoked, so you could argue this is time independent or doesn't require time to be. And that's kind of what we would say, right? As long as P1 and P2 don't depend on time, and mathematics is a great place to find these sorts of examples, then C shouldn't depend on time either. There's no reason to expect that C would depend on time, because then that would mean there was a time that P was, but Q was not. And one thing I want to mention too is this isn't really a new idea. Many of the old philosophers, and I mean old out of respect, like Aristotle and Aquinas, thought that there were different types of causes. And some of those causes you could argue would be temporal, but not all of them necessarily. So one of these examples be like an efficient cause, which is generally an explanation in terms of an act of will or mind, but you also have these other types of causes like formal causes and material causes. So if you consider the question, why is the water boiling? You can imagine there are several causes, and you have to concern all of those possible causes to get a full picture of the story. So the formal cause, in terms of, what arrangement it's made up of, and the sort of the material would be like what it's made of, but then the formal cause is like how it's arranged and kind of these more, you could argue, perhaps accidental properties. And you could say then, thermal energy in the form of radiation from the stove is converted into kinetic energy of water molecules. Here you have convection, these sorts of things. This would be your formal cause. But you can also have a sort of efficient cause as well, like I turned on the stove. Or you could also have a final cause, like I turned on the stove because I want a cup of tea. And all of these causes, and Aristotle has his 4 causes, and Aquinas was using them as well, all kind of come together to give you a full picture of the thing. Now, many of the formal causes we can consider, and perhaps material causes to a certain degree, will invoke time as a necessary part of the explanation. But final and efficient causes may not, or may not necessarily. So to claim, and then, what some materialists are going to try to say is, well, we can explain all of our final causes and efficient causes by material causes. But that claim, the claim that all final causes can be explained to or reduced to material ones, has been disputed by many prominent philosophers of mind. You can, David Chalmers, who I personally know, Thomas Nagel, who's just probably, I would consider, one of the best living philosophers, period. So I think they have very good arguments as to why we should at least be skeptical of the reduction of these other types of causes to purely material ones. So then the question becomes, how can God create time? And there are a couple different ways this can be thought of. The first thing is to realize that the universe exists as a product of God's eternal and unchanging will. And God's will is a sort of final cause. And God's act of creating the universe is the efficient cause, which follows necessarily from his, necessary existence, which is, his will as well. As Richard Swinburne would probably say, God can create ex nihilo as a basic action. Just in the same way, we move our arm, our thought causes this motion or change. God can just create out of his will and his ability to create, both as a final cause and efficient cause coming together. As a result, God could, at least in theory, create space-time ex nihilo, out of nothing. Of course, when we say out of nothing, we mean God exists and then decides to create, and he can create out of nothing, not that, nothing exists and God created himself or anything like that. So there are several options for God's creation of space-time ex nihilo. There's divine timelessness, which is the idea that God exists outside of time. And as some would say, perhaps it is God's non-temporal eternity, and basically the world exists because God is always willing all things about the world, which of course includes creation itself. Then you have people in the camp of divine temporality, and I should say there are people in both of these camps, and then also people in the hybrid view, which we'll talk about in a second. People in divine temporality are going to say, God is either bound by time, or time always exists, and God has always existed in time. I don't really find this view all that compelling, in part because, one, it suggests that there's this thing called time that God is bound to, and that, questions God's ability to be the greatest being if he's in some ways bound by time. And then there's also these problems with infinity. If God exists infinitely and has existed in the infinite past as opposed to just exists outside of time, you have these problems with infinitely negative times and positive times and infinite extents, which some would argue lead to these contradictions. I would argue lead to these contradictions. So I'm not the biggest fan of this. But then you have these hybrid views, which are kind of interesting. So some will say, God isn't in physical time, although he is everlastingly temporal. And this is the idea of metaphysical time, or some would say, God time, which could be different than the time we experience in terms of physics, physical time. There's metrically amorphous time, which would be later Swinburne and Paget, which basically says, once God creates the world and instantiates the laws of natures, that's when time acquires its own metric. And at that point, there begin to be facts of the matter about how long temporal intervals are, but those things don't exist prior to God's creative action. So that's kind of a hybrid view that time didn't always exist, time began to exist, but it's kind of different in a different way as well. And then you have Craig's view, which is the idea that God is timeless without the universe and temporal with the universe, which another way you could say Craig's view is that God creates time and then freely enters into it. And one of the ways you could argue for this is just say, just in the Christian view, you have the incarnation. God came into the physical world with Jesus. You could say he also chose to enter into the temporal world. So this idea being that God isn't just this passive observer, but he's always coming in, to the world to I guess, be with us to a certain degree. Now, my view is a little different. My view, it's kind of like these hybrid views, but it's my idea that God's will is necessary and outside of time. So God just has a will, but God's will includes his desire to create time and to be a part of it. So as a result, time is basically contingent upon God's necessary will, which makes it logically necessary, but it's not really necessary in and of itself. It's necessary because of God's will. And as a result, God's will and nature are unchanging, but his actions may change depending on our choices. And you can imagine, God has his will, but depending on the choices we make, he may be reacting to our changes given his will or his overall final goal for humanity. So his actions may change in response to our actions, but the will itself is eternal and unchanging. And you could argue, God's actions are in some ways contingent upon our actions to a certain degree, but God's will is not. So you could basically say it like this, premise one, if God wills space-time, then time will exist. God wills there to be space-time, and time exists. And basically the argument here is that because God's will is eternal, unchanging, and metaphysically necessary, the antecedent here is necessarily true. So time cannot not exist, but time doesn't exist in and of itself. God exists, God is being itself, and time exists contingent upon God's will to create time, and of course his ability to create time, which he does do. So that is why we have time. So time had to exist, but not had to exist in and of itself. It had to exist because God exists and God wills there to be time. And once again, tracing things back to the metaphysically necessary being, the ground of all being, the greatest metaphysical being, these sorts of things that we define as God. So anyway, thanks for watching. I'm curious what you guys think. Let me know in the comments, and yeah, have a good one.